Hi, and welcome everyone to episode 4 of Join the Pod. I think we're really starting to get into the swing of things, which is great. The only announcement we have today is that Maria is not with us for this episode because she is in the final rush of her PhD. So today's episode is entitled On the Road to Sustainability, Do Marine Renewables Impact Marine Mammals? So I'm just going to start by giving a very quick introduction of this topic, introduce today's speakers, and then we're going to dive right into today's talks. So when we talk about marine renewables, this encompasses all methods that harness energy for human use from marine waters, such as tidal turbines or wave energy converters, as well as offshore wind farms. Harnessing energy like this is going to increase significantly in the next few decades. In Ireland, for example, we have a target of acquiring 70% of our energy from renewable resources by 2030. And as part of this, we're going to see a huge expansion of wind farms along our coastline. The transformation of the energy industry to one that is driven by sustainable methods is a fantastic step forward. This change is propelled by the need to improve our relationship with nature and reducing our impact on this planet. So it's important to bring this ethos into every step of the development and running of this industry, which includes considering the impact it can have on the marine habitats where these industries are being established and the species that occupy these habitats. So today we have three fantastic speakers who are going to talk about their research in this field of the impact of marine renewables on marine mammals. Dr. Joe Onoufriou, Dr. Nicholas Horne, and Dr. Katherine Whyte. So Joe is a marine ecologist specializing in phocids and their interaction with anthropogenic activity. He completed his PhD at the University of St Andrews, where he studied the movement ecology of harbour seals in tidal stream environments and how their movement and distribution was affected by installation and operation of a tidal turbine array off the north coast of Scotland. Our second speaker today is Nick. He is a research fellow at Queen's University Belfast, where he also gained his PhD working on simulating collision risk between marine wildlife and tidal energy converters. His research focuses on the interactions between marine fauna and humans, where he makes use of various modelling techniques to investigate these relationships. He has undertaken multiple research projects in this area, including studies into bottlenose dolphins in Aberdeen Harbour and seals depredating from fishing lines in County Mayo in Ireland. Then our final speaker today, Katherine, is an ecological and environmental statistician at Biomathematics and Statistics Scotland. She recently completed her PhD at the Sea Mammal Research Unit, investigating the potential effects of offshore wind farms on seals. Her research explores the interactions between marine top predators and offshore renewable energy developments, using and developing statistical tools to answer applied questions. So now we're going to launch straight into our first talk by Joe, entitled The Impact of Marine Renewable Energy on Marine Mammals, Current State of Knowledge and a Case Study in the Tidal Energy Industry.
Hello everyone, my name is Joe Onoufriou, and today I'm going to give a brief introduction to the topic of marine mammals and renewable energy, and then chat about some of the specifics of the work I've been involved in investigating the impact of tidal energy on seals and porpoises. Now, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is quite UK-centric, which is largely due to the fact that this is where the bulk of the work on these interactions has been carried out. But I just wanted to point out that work on these issues in the wider ocean has really started to pick up steam, so please don't take this as an exhaustive overview of all of the work that has been carried out so far. So to begin with, we're going to talk broadly about renewables and marine mammals and some of the considerations that we have to take into account when we're considering some of the interactions between these two groups. Now, in order to meet ambitious climate change targets, the demand for renewable energy is increasing and bringing substantial industrial activity to marine environments. In particular, the number, size and capacity of offshore wind farms has been growing rapidly and is expected to continue to increase. This expansion has been particularly prevalent in European waters, where there are currently more than 4,500 grid-connected offshore wind turbines across 11 countries, equivalent to a capacity of about 18,500 megawatts. The tidal energy industry is in its infancy compared to other renewable energy sources like offshore wind. However, The spatial and temporal predictability of tidal currents makes it an attractive choice, with many sites around the world being proposed for development. Now, while marine renewable energy proliferation brings with it potentially massive and far-reaching environmental benefits, it also brings several environmental concerns which must be addressed to ensure a sustainable future. And the effect of marine renewable energy to marine mammals varies considerably by the type of device that is being used, i.e. is it static or dynamic, the type of energy that it's trying to harness, wave, tidal, riverine, and the spatial scale and extent of the installations. So are we looking at single devices or arrays, and where are these devices positioned? Now, in this context, risk for the animals is defined as the interaction of the probability or likelihood of a deleterious outcome with the consequences if such an outcome occurs. Now, these environmental concerns aren't exclusive to any one species. They're far-reaching across the marine mammal community and also beyond the marine mammal community, with seabirds, fish, and invertebrates also noted as being potentially heavily affected by these installations. However, for the purposes of this talk, we are going to focus on the marine mammals. So on to some of the specific environmental concerns and considerations for marine mammals. For wind energy devices, first and foremost, we have chronic noise disturbance from increased vessel traffic and acute disturbance from pile driving. Most marine mammals are characteristically acoustically sensitive. Therefore, these elevated noise levels can cause temporary or even possibly permanent threshold shift, which can affect the animal's ability to successfully navigate, forage, and interact with conspecifics. Further, these elevated noises could induce avoidance of ecologically important sites, shifting distributions and affecting overall population fitness if suitable alternatives aren't readily available. And later on, you're going to hear a talk from Katherine Whyte, who will go into this in much more detail. We can see changes in community structure and habitat alteration, the so-called artificial reef effect. The jackets that the turbines are mounted on can act as a substrate for sedentary invertebrates and flora. And then we could see bottom-up trophic cascades that attract shellfish, then nekton, and finally marine mammal predators into the area. And these could become sites of elevated foraging for these animals. It really is important to note, though, in this area that this might not be an exclusively positive effect of renewable energy devices, as these could start acting as ecological traps for lower trophic level species and causing elevated predation on animals. It might start affecting community structures in a negative way. They could indeed provide refuge, though, in a positive light. This would be in the form of protection from excluded vessels, reduction in overall noise disturbance, and reduction in bycatch risk. So fishing vessels which aren't permitted to be able to fish in the renewable energy zone would not be there to cause potential bycatch risk. And then finally, we've got, for floating wind, the potential for entanglement through interaction with anchor lines, and also the potential for ghost fishing, whereby discarded fishing gear which gets wrapped up in these anchor lines and provides an additional source of potential bycatch. Onto the tidal energy industry now. Now, the main cause for concern as far as marine mammals go in the tidal energy industry is that of collision. Tidal energy works by harnessing the predictable motions of the tide, much the same way that wind energy devices work, and this requires moving parts to rotate turbines and dynamos in order to produce electricity. All these moving parts have to be subsurface. Therefore, co-occurrence with marine mammals could potentially cause deleterious interactions when these animals come into contact with the moving parts. And Nick Horne in the talk after this is going to go into this issue in a lot more detail. There could be some potential barrier effects with the tidal energy industry. Animals could start avoiding ecologically important sites due to exposure to the physical barrier of a turbine array sitting on the bottom of the sea, or perceived barriers of these elevated noises of the turbines in constant operation, causing animals to move to a different site. And this is a possibly huge problem for the tidal energy industry, in that many previous studies have noted these sites to be of huge ecologically important for top predators, for things like migration and foraging. Similar to the wind energy industry, we could see changes in community structure and habitat alteration, this artificial reef effect stemming from growth on the mounts of the turbines. And finally, we could also start seeing risk to animals from electromagnetic fields emitted by electric cables, affecting the animal's ability to navigate, affecting their more nuanced sensors. So that brings us to part 2. How do marine mammals respond to an operating tidal turbine array? Now, partly due to the limited number of operational tidal turbine arrays, studies investigating the avoidance or attraction of marine mammals to turbine arrays and the consequent changes in density and distribution have been limited to measuring responses to controlled acoustic exposures or single test turbines. These studies showed that marine mammals do exhibit avoidance responses to single devices, such as Hasty et al. 2017's paper that found that harbour seal abundance decreased significantly up to 500 metres from a speaker playing tidal turbine sounds. And similarly, Carol Sparling's work showed that seals transited past the test turbine at greater distances during operational periods. Now, although useful in understanding the potential collision risks associated with single turbines, to ensure that the industry develops in an environmentally sustainable manner, data on the responses by animals to operational turbines is urgently required. And to tackle this issue, we sought to quantify seal distributions around a tidal turbine array in the Pentland Firth and establish whether any differences between pre-installation and post-installation periods, as well as during operational and non-operational periods, existed. This would allow us to provide updated medium-scale avoidance estimates for use in collision risk models, which can help establish the population level effects of these devices. And Nick Horne in the follow-up talk will talk more about these collision risk models. The largest tidal turbine array in the world, as measured by power generation potential and device size, is located off the north coast of Scotland. This is also an area where a relatively large but rapidly declining population of harbour seals exists. Major haul-out sites on the north coast of Scotland are all within 10 kilometres of the turbine array, and there's likely to be significant overlap between the seals at sea distribution and the turbine array. While uncertainty around close-range avoidance or manoeuvrability cannot be specifically addressed with the presented data, this analysis aims at characterising potential displacement or attraction, which can ultimately help to refine estimates of collision rates by augmenting our understanding of how relative abundances will be affected. To quantify the seals distributions, we use movement data from GPS tags and fit habitat preference models using observed presences and pseudo-absences as our response variable in a GAM-GEE framework. And I'm happy to take any questions about what this means afterwards. And what we found was that there was no detectable change in distribution between pre- and post-installation periods, and that the seal distribution was driven primarily by tidal dynamics. So it appears that over the relatively short time that the turbines have been in the water, foraging locations of the seals have not been significantly altered. However, the model including operational and non-operational periods noted some difference between these times and suggested that seals were avoiding areas within the inner channel during operational phases. Now, this map shows within each 500 by 500 metre grid cell in the study area how the estimated seal abundance changed when the turbines were operating. Now, we can see some large decreases and increases in the area. But when we compute the confidence intervals around these estimates, we see that the grid cells showing significant decreases are within approximately 2 kilometres from the turbine structures, along with an area showing significant increases in abundance to the northwest of this site. It therefore appears that the seals are actively avoiding the turbines when they are operating, but continue to use the site during non-operational periods. Therefore, overall, what we found were that foraging opportunities do not appear to be hindered over the entire deployment period of a tidal turbine array. But seals will choose different sites when the acoustic signature of the turbines is detectable. It also must be noted that the turbines had only been in the water for about a year once we completed this study, so it's very important in the future to see how these effects might evolve as the turbines have been in the water for longer and the seals have been exposed to the operations of these devices for a longer period of time. So we've seen that it's important to consider changing spatial distributions as a function of renewable energy operations in order to successfully estimate risk. However, it's also important to determine what lethal removal from a population as a consequence of collision might be. Essentially, can we assume each collision represents a removal of an individual from a population, or is there a range of possibilities? So how do we actually assess potential mortality? Physical damage can be hypothesized using morphometrics derived from pathological analysis and computer simulations. But blunt force trauma and skeletal vulnerability is quite difficult to resolve hypothetically. Empirical determination is more robust given an accurate experimental design, and we hypothesize that this is probably necessary given the distribution of blade speeds over a typical tidal cycle which suggest varying degrees of collision severity. So in order to test this hypothesis, we need to come up with an empirical simulation. And so what we did was we built our own tidal turbine blade and affixed it to the front of our workboat. We then sought to collect several seal carcasses from natural strandings around the coast of the UK and subjected these carcasses to pre-trial assessment to assess whether or not there was any underlying skeletal trauma before we actually went ahead with the trials. We then set up the trials by buoying the animals within a mesh bag and anchoring these bags to the sea floor with a quick release device. So upon impact, the animal would be released and subject to the typical forces that an animal being hit by a turbine blade would be subjected to. We then drove the boat at the seals at a range of collision speeds in order to assess what the ultimate damage would be. We were able to complete 28 trials across 14 different individuals at speeds ranging between 4.5 and 10.5 meters per second, and attempted to strike each seal carcass on the head, spine, and pelvis. However, due to the small size of some of the individuals, this wasn't possible in all cases. We then undertook pathological analysis as well as post-trial CT scans to assess both the skeletal damage and any soft tissue damage that the seals underwent. All cases that showed any soft tissue damage also showed significant skeletal damage, which justified the use of pre-trial CT scans in isolation to assess pre-existing trauma. And here you can see the spread of the injuries across all of the individuals and the mean collision speeds that individual was subjected to. The red box is indicating presence of that pathological identifier of damage, and green the absence of it. We then use these results to build a model to try and predict what the likelihood of mortality would be given variations in collision speed. The input parameters here and the response variable was the presence of any pathological indicator of mortality for that individual. And as you can see here, the point estimate of likelihood of severe trauma being greater than a benign impact is about 5.1 meters per second, with a range indicated by the confidence intervals of between 3.2 and 6.6 meters per second. We also tried to see whether or not the blubber depth of an individual, which might provide some protection, had an effect on the likelihood of mortality. And it seems that the fitness of the seal may play a role in their ability to withstand trauma. However, the signal was a bit too weak for any certainty in this regard, and we think we would need more carcasses in order to be able to actually say for sure whether or not there was an effect. But it does appear that the general trend is suggesting that there is an overall decrease in the probability of severe trauma with an increase of the fitness or blubber depth of the animal. Finally, this is the proportion of the turbine blade sweep zone that would be fatal given a perpendicular collision integrated over representative current speeds at a turbine lease site for a given device. Now, it's very important to note with this figure that this is conservative, as the energy imparted to the seal will be concentrated over a smaller area closer to the tip, and therefore the effects will be far more acute than an impact with, for example, the middle of the blade, which has a far larger surface area being offered up to the seal during a perpendicular collision, and therefore less likely to cause traumatic injury. However, we can see the maximum proportion reaches an asymptote at about 0.5. Now, this highlights mainly, I think, the requirement for adjustment of these values to various devices, environments, and indeed speeds of collision when you're looking at different types of device. So when we look at this within the context of a tidal cycle, we start getting an idea of the number of potential collisions one might expect to be fatal over a given time period. Now, this histogram represents the proportion of binned impact speeds one would expect with randomly moving seals through a turbine sweep zone over a tidal cycle. Now, you could also think of this as the frequency of the binned speeds the turbine is spinning over a tidal cycle, and taking into account the variation in speeds across the length of the blade and over changing current speeds. And what we see is that, given our modelled mortality estimates and associated uncertainty, we could conclude that at least 39% of all collisions between seals and tidal turbines will result in fatality. So in summary, collisions between seals and tidal turbines can be lethal, but the speeds at which fatality is guaranteed are not likely to be enduring over a typical tidal cycle. We can use these data to refine collision risk models, and again, Nick is going to talk in much more detail about this in the next talk. But a better understanding of less dramatic injuries are required to provide a more robust estimate, and these results can't necessarily be generalized across different devices, and I think this is a very important step in the future for robustness of collision risk modeling. So what are some of the data gaps, and what does the future hold for this research field? Well, the models, such as those that I've presented, can be really effective at quantifying uncertainty, but several data gaps exist that would allow us to be more confident in the results and the uncertainty that these models forecast. Things like empirical demography, for example. Extensive baseline knowledge of demography is required to effectively parameterize a lot of these models, such as life history parameters, population growth rate and age at first reproduction or sexual maturity, and abundance estimates are really, really valuable in order to see how the populations might be responding to this proliferation. Now, these sort of parameter estimates are further along for animals that are more easily counted and surveyed, such as seals, but the uncertainty around these metrics for porpoises and dolphins remains a challenge for the industry. We need to test whether baseline levels of fecundity, for example, of known populations changes as a result to increasing exposure. And this is going to be quite tricky to do for cetaceans into the future and requires a lot more focus. So we need to have a look at any recorded physiological harm, like calibrated received sound levels from pile driving to observed animals. This occurrence of threshold shifts as a result of exposure to loud impulsive noises is a real bugbear for the industry. And something that we can do to try and move this along is things like recapturing of seals to test hearing function before and after exposure to pile driving activity, or things like modeling acoustic soundscapes along with calibration data and cetacean monitoring, both visual and acoustic, so we can get baseline abundances for cetaceans across the North Sea and the Atlantic to determine pre-proliferation levels, and then see what those levels are after the wind farms start expanding throughout. We also really need to keep assessing the prevalence of this artificial reef effect. Do wind farms really offset negative effects of installation by providing increased foraging opportunities? And what are the temporal trends throughout the life cycle of a wind farm? Is what happening now with regards to animal foraging behavior around wind farms going to continue into the future? Or is this industrialization of the oceans actually going to end up having an overall negative effect as it becomes more widespread? With that, I'd like to say thank you very much for listening and hand over to Nick and Katie, who are going to answer some of those questions that I posed at the end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, for your presentation. It gave us a really nice and complete overview of the topic. It was really insightful to hear about the range of impacts on marine mammals. I think it's far wider than what one could think at first. It's not limited to one type of impact. And the examples you gave on the distribution modeling, case studies, and the trials to determine which type of injuries are likely to be caused by collisions was super interesting. So I think now we all have the good background to be able to jump into more details, and then we're going to do that with Nick and his talk on collision risk between marine mammals and tidal turbines.
Hi, and thanks for watching. I'm going to be overviewing some of the work that I did during my PhD, where I focused on simulating collision risk between tidal energy converters and marine wildlife. So some context for modelling collision risk. Well, we know collision risk is an issue for wind turbines and birds and bats. We know they collide, and therefore when we started to put stuff underwater into tidal regions, the same issue was posed where, well, are they likely to have an effect on seals or other marine life? Are they likely to collide with tidal turbines? And this is an important question. There's a lot of unknowns around that. It's quite hard to kind of detect these things underwater, as opposed to with birds. You can't walk around the base of a tidal turbine and look for carcasses, and so it is something that's unknown right now. And therefore, that's where collision risk modelling comes in, but also to kind of estimate those population level effects, because marine mammals are typically they're slow breeding species. Their seals will only have a pup a year, and therefore any collisions that are occurring are likely to have a population level effect. So that's why they're a key element environmental impact assessments for tidal developments, especially in the UK and many other areas as well. And they have been a consenting issue in the past, especially a key example is the Maygen development in the Penland Firth, where Joe will have spoken about that in plenty of detail. But that consenting process, one of the key elements in that license was limiting the number of turbines in the water was the issue of collision risk, because it's put right next to a decline in population of harbour seals, and there was a lot of uncertainty, and so a precautionary approach was taken in the assessment, and therefore a limited license was granted based on those. Therefore, collision risk modelling and developing improved collision risk models is a key thing for driving forward the tidal energy industry as it tries to aid us towards net zero. And so there are many things that can affect collision risk. This can kind of go over a few of those things and into three broad categories. You have device effects, such as the shape and the size of that device, and how fast it would rotate, the type of device, but also the environmental effects on collision risk models, such as the tidal speeds, the turbulence in that region, even the water depth. And then one of the major areas of effects on the models are the animal side, so the behaviour of that animal, the shape and the size of that animal, the species, and important two key areas are that avoidance and evasion. The avoidance being avoidance of the area of the tidal turbine, and the evasion being the ability of that animal to evade direct collision with a part of that tidal turbine. So those are really some key factors that will affect collision risk. So collision risk models are there to try and make sense of all those influences, take that data, run it through a model, and then give you a number of collisions over a time period such as a year. The first models were developed for wind turbines and then have been since adapted to tidal. The band model is one of those first, and for example, this is the graphical representation of how the equations in the band model produce the swept area of the tidal turbine, and then you take that information, combine it with information on the animal, and produce a number of collisions over a year. Similarly, the encounter rate model takes equations from a predator-prey model and adapts that to tidal turbines as well. And this is also a graphical representation of how that equation works, where it takes the area swept by the turbine and the density of animals in that area and the velocity of those animals and the velocity of the device, and produces a number of collisions over a year. These models, like I say, based on equations, they have their limitations. Firstly, the angle of approach is potentially a key parameter for collision risk, where the band model only calculates based off of a horizontal angle of approach, and the encounter rate model calculates with an equal probability of angle of approach from any angle. But it's quite likely that some species may favour a certain angle of approach that may not be horizontal, and it may not be uniform over all areas, all angles of approach. So that could be a key parameter to be addressed. They also use simplified shapes, both of the animal and the devices. They typically produce a single output value for the swept area of that device. They also have that lack of flexibility. For example, because these equations are quite fixed, it takes a lot of work to make adaptations to these equations or make developments, and it's something that could be potentially addressed. One of those lack of flexibilities is the fact that not all devices are horizontal axis turbines. There may be novel device designs, such as tidal kites, that move in these three-dimensional figure of eights, where that cannot be modelled using simple equations. And that's what led to the development of this simulation-based approach to collision risk, where we can simulate the 3D shape of a tidal kite and its movement, and then use that to produce collision probabilities. As I said, the simulation-based approach came from that, where that 3D movement, and you can calculate the probability from a single transit, which is part of the equation used in the band model, and then you can take that probability, combine it with the density of animals in the area, the movement through the area, and then get a number of collisions over a year. Well, I've been developing this model now in Blender, which is a game engine. It's an open source Python based piece of software that's it's just highly flexible. There really is no limit to what can be achieved. You have complete control over the movement of your shapes in that 3D environment, so the animal and the device. And so there's a lot that can be done with that. And one of those advantages, as I said before, is that novel device design, such as the tidal kite, but also then bringing in things like the horizontal axis turbine and even cross-flow devices, which have these quite unique shapes. This work showing these various device designs was published in the conference proceedings of the European Wave and Tidal Conference. The other work that I've been focusing on with this is developing the variety of ecological inputs that can be used, and then also working on the post-processing of the outputs from the model itself. This is the graphical abstract from the paper from this work, published in the Journal of Environmental Management, where I showed how we could take various inputs, and the example inputs we used were the angle of approach, where we tested 2 angles of approach. We tested 2 speeds of the animal and 2 sizes of animal, such as like an adult and a pup-sized seal, and we showed how those produce different collision probabilities. We did this for the tidal kite using the Blender software, and then we also showed how you can then incorporate more information in the post-processing stage, where the results, because the method we're using produces results with collision probabilities for each point over the swept area, we can then add in additional information and process that based on, for example, here we use the depth, the probability of animals being at certain depths. And then we showed how those detailed outputs can give you a really lots of information for making informed decisions in the consenting process. And as you can see here, you have this graphical output where you can see some darker patches where there's a higher probability of collision and some lighter patches where there's a lower probability of collision, showing that it's not a uniform distribution of collision probability over that swept area, especially not for a tidal kite. I've been focusing mostly recently on the mortality side of the model, and this development to address mortality, which it builds on the work done by Joe, who talked previously, where he worked on investigations into mortality, looking at the potential speeds that a turbine blade would have to move at to cause severe damage to a seal. And what I then have developed is the aspects of the simulation-based model to produce both the speed of the collision on the animal and the location of where that collision occurs. This can then take that information into account. We can make decisions based on how fast and where those collisions occur into determining mortality. For example, by applying a threshold of speed, such as all collisions above 5 meters per second are deemed fatal and all collisions below that are not. And here I can talk through one of the graphics from that work where I'm highlighting the 5 meters per second threshold. So these are the probabilities of collision, where the grey section, the bottom grey section, sorry, I am colourblind, so everything's always grey with me. The mid grey section is all the collisions above 5 meters per second, and so that's around a 0.6 probability for collisions above 5 meters per second. But there is a lack of information on the possibility of concussions in seals, so you may want to take a more precautionary approach where you take all collisions with the head as fatal, and therefore this may add another 0.2 probability on top of that, which is that light grey. And then this darkest grey there, the black section, really shows the number of collisions, the probability of collisions that are dropped off by taking mortality into account rather than taking just purely all collisions as fatal. And this development really can be something that can help give that extra bit of information to people in the consenting process. The future of this model, we're taking it forward now. What we have done is validated it against the band and ERM models, and I'm working on trying to get that work written up for publication now, alongside the code for this model, trying to tie that up and have it in a neat format so that other people can potentially take this model forward and use it themselves. So developments are ongoing still, where, for example, the sensitivity analysis, I'm working on a comprehensive sensitivity analysis of collision risk modelling, where all the various inputs that I showed earlier, we can test those and try and understand where the biggest influences on collision risk are. And that potentially could guide future data collection, where potentially help those in the field to collect the most useful data for lowering that uncertainty around collision risk. Also, I'll be working on randomizing the inputs, so using more of a stochastic method of inputs that will allow us then to produce more, make better use of input data, but then also produce higher, produce quality confidence intervals around those values. And really, the overall idea is getting it ready for as much data as possible as some of that comes about. So there is a lot of data on the way, especially around animal behaviour, around tidal turbines, which will be extremely transformative. Two of the major inputs to collision risk models that are being addressed are the avoidance and evasion, and really the key kind of bits of research going on now in the field that will be extremely helpful are the 3D passive acoustic tracking, 3D sonar tracking, and then also underwater video. All this information being gathered can then be used to help give us better data to then put into collision risk models like the one I've been talking about. Like I said, that key data on avoidance and evasion, that's where we believe a lot of the influence is likely to be. We'll see as I do the sensitivity analysis, but hopefully we can outline how that can be addressed, and like people like Joe have been working very hard to get more information on those factors. And here's just a short clip of some of the underwater footage that I've been gathering here in Strangford Lough on a tidal turbine, across a vertical axis tidal turbine. And I'm working on gathering video information on whether or not animals approach the device in Strangford Lough, which has plenty of seals in the area, but so far, after looking at quite a lot of hours of footage, I haven't seen a single seal yet, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, this is all about the consenting process, really. So this kind of information, this underwater footage and the 3D tracking, and also a lot of the work going on to get the best out of tagging data of marine mammals. This will all inform the collision risk models and then give us the best data to give to the people making those consenting decisions, and ensuring that we help the tidal industry grow, but in a sustainable way, in a sustainable development manner, which is the key point. Because we need to address climate change, but we need to do so in a way that ensures we don't have detrimental impacts on the planet as well. So thanks everyone for listening, and thanks to my supervisory team, and thanks to my funders as well. Bye.
Thanks, Nick, for this really interesting talk. It's always really nice to have a bit of an input on what's going on with people that are actually developing those models. I think it's really interesting because usually you get them if some people are using them, and if you're not an expert, it's very hard to understand kind of how it works and what it does. So this is really interesting to know a bit what is going into those models. I'm not, for example, working on collisions and so on at all, so I have actually no idea about how these things work. So it's really interesting. And I was laughing a bit inside with that video there. It's you know how people always think when you say I'm a marine mammal biologist, and they're like, oh, so you go at sea and you see animals all the time. No, most of the time you watch videos and you don't see any. It was fun. Anyway, so yeah, thank you for this talk. It was really, really nice. Okay, so now we are going to move to the last talk from Katherine Whyte, and her talk is entitled Under the Surface, Tracking Seals Around Offshore Wind Farms.
Hello. In this talk, I'm going to give an overview of how seals may interact or be affected by offshore wind farms. In contrast to the previous talks, which may have mainly focused on the effects of tidal turbine developments, when we're thinking about offshore wind and marine mammals, the main environmental concerns actually come from underwater noise. Underwater noise is thought to be particularly high during the construction period, and if pile driving is used, this can produce really high intensity sounds. Pile driving, for those not familiar, is the process by which the foundations of the wind farm are essentially hammered into the sea floor. It can start out slowly, but it quickly ramps up until hammer blows are about once every second, and the process can last for several hours to install a single wind turbine. And of course, wind farms themselves are made up of multiple turbines. So in total, to install a whole wind farm, we're talking about maybe tens to hundreds of hours of this pile driving activity and this noise production, which is released into the sea and may affect any marine mammals which are passing through the area. As a result of this construction activity, which has begun during offshore wind farms, a number of studies have looked at its potential effect on acoustically sensitive cetacean species such as the harbour porpoise. And overall, many of these studies have agreed in finding that the numbers of porpoises expected to be present near a wind farm is a lot lower when pile driving activity is happening. However, seals often use a lot of these areas too, and there's really high overlap between the habitat use of seals and the areas that are currently with offshore wind farms and the areas that are proposed for future offshore wind development. And so therefore it's possible that seals may also face the same sort of impacts as cetaceans. In particular, there's a requirement for seals to travel between a land-based haul-out site and areas at sea where they need to forage and get food. So they're frequently passing through these coastal areas that are often highly used by humans and potential hotspots for offshore wind development. Whilst they're at sea, seals also spend almost 80 to 90% of their time submerged in dives, so spending a really high proportion of their time under the water where they are potentially exposed to these sounds during pile driving. A couple of the first studies to look into the potential effects on seals looked at haul-out behaviour, so they used visual surveys to quantify the numbers of seals using haul-out sites during construction. And they looked at both harbour and grey seals, and generally they found that there were less seals using haul-out sites during these construction activities. And I really recommend looking at these two studies if you want to find out more. However, the haul-out time of a seal is just really a small proportion of its life. It varies a lot between individuals, time of year and region, but in general seals might spend only 10 to 30% of their time hauled out on land, and so the vast majority of their life is actually spent out at sea, when they may be even closer or even more likely to interact with this pile driving sound. So it's important that we also find out what seals are doing when they're at sea and how they may be affected by offshore wind developments during their at sea life. In order to do that, we can attach tags or animal-borne recording devices which record and tell us information about their movement and dive behaviour. A variety of devices have been developed, such as that by the SMRU Instrumentation Group, and these work by recording their movements and behaviour and then sending it back to us via the satellite network or via the mobile phone network, so that we always get the information back from each seal that we tag. Now we can use these tags to tell us about where seals go, but how do we know about the pile driving, particularly if we use a tagging device which doesn't record sound? Well, we can get information on when the pile driving occurred from offshore wind developers, and we can use something called an acoustic propagation model to quantify and predict how the sound will spread across the environment, across space and also across depth. And if we have our information on where the seals went, our seal tracks, we can combine that with the pile driving sounds to quantify when seals encountered areas of loud pile driving and when seals encountered areas of quiet pile driving and when they didn't encounter it at all. And as I said, these tags also record depth, so we can look at how seals encountered pile driving sounds as they dived in their three-dimensional movement as well as their two-dimensional movement. And this gives us quite a lot of information. So I'm going to briefly look at 3 studies that have tried to answer questions about how seals may be affected by pile driving sounds. These studies aim to answer, firstly, may this pile driving sound cause hearing damage? Secondly, does the distribution of seals change during pile driving? And thirdly, does the behaviour of seals change during pile driving activity? To look at hearing damage, we need to use understanding of, from captive studies, of what level of sound may cause hearing damage in seals. A number of thresholds have been published on this, as I said, from captive studies, and we can use this to compare the amount of sound that our seals heard in the wild to these known thresholds to estimate whether our wild seals may have experienced hearing damage. So in this study we had 24 seals that were 24 harbour seals that were present around an offshore wind farm construction in the UK. And we have track information for those. And we estimated how much sound they may have heard during each day and compared this to the levels that would be required to cause a temporary threshold shift in hearing. And by that I mean that their hearing would temporarily become less sensitive, but it would recover. And using this, we estimated that 17% of the seals, or 4 individuals, were estimated to have this temporary hearing damage. But for permanent hearing damage, we didn't find any individuals that exceeded this threshold. Although this may be somewhat promising, it doesn't really tell the whole picture, because it's possible that seals may have exhibited behavioural changes to avoid encountering these levels of high sound that cause hearing damage. And so the second study that I want to show you is one that looks at seal distribution during pile driving. So as I said, we have tracks that show us where all the animals went, where each individual went out from the haul-out site, and how it moved past and through the wind farm. We also have information on when the pile driving occurred. We can see it happened intermittently over several months at all times of day, and we know how loud it was as well from our previous acoustic propagation model. We can then look at, we can then sort of grid up our study area into different spatial grids and look at how individuals use the space. So what areas did they use most and what areas did they use least? And we can compare this between times of baseline, when we know there was no pile driving, to times of known pile driving. And using a statistical model, we can robustly compare what's called the distribution of animals between these two periods to see if there are any significant differences. And when we did this, we found that there were actually significant decreases in density, or the number of seals expected to be using a certain area, predicted for areas out to 25 kilometres from pile driving when it was happening. And it was this difference was seen in sort of every incremental distance band out to that 25 kilometre limit. This corresponded to seals being less likely to be seen less likely to be present when sound levels from the pile driving were 145 dB decibels or louder. Again, this still doesn't give us the whole picture, so this tells us where seals were, but it doesn't tell us what seals were doing during pile driving. And this is where the work from my PhD has come in and tried to answer this question. So from our tags, we have various movement tracks and dive behaviour information over time. And to look at behaviour, we can change these locational information to calculate several informative metrics that tell us about the individual's behaviour. So for horizontal movement, we can calculate metrics such as speed, the animal's heading, or the variability in heading. For the vertical behaviour or dive behaviour, we can calculate metrics such as dive duration, surface duration, or the depth of the dive. And we can look at plot these over time to see how they may change. In order to quantify this, we divided up our data into a series of time windows, and calculated the change between different time windows to look at how the animal's behaviour was changing over time. And what we wanted to do was identify times when we thought the behaviour change in the animal was highly unusual. So to do that, we compared behaviour change during exposure or predicted exposure to pile driving sounds to baseline periods when there was it was known that there was no pile driving activity occurring. And if the amount of behaviour change was really high during the pile driving activity, we considered this to be a possible, what we call a response, so an unusual reaction in response to the sound that was present at that time. And when we applied this to our data, we found several instances of unusual movement behaviour. In terms of horizontal behaviour, we found instances where animals were travelling at an unusually high movement speed. We also found instances when animals were travelling normally horizontally but then suddenly stopped when pile driving began. And we also found instances where animals were almost stationary at the surface, potentially resting, but then suddenly initiated movement away from pile driving or back towards the haul-out site when this construction activity started up. In terms of dive behaviour, we also identified unusual instances of diving. In these responses, we found that seals tended to dive for a shorter duration of time. They also spent much more time at the surface after the dives. And during these unusual behaviours, they also tended to use a lower proportion of the available water column when they were diving. Now, I've mainly focused on the effects of pile driving today, but what about after construction? Well, this study has looked at tracking of seals which were present around an operational wind farm, so after all the construction activity has ended. And what you can see is that this individual repeatedly makes trips from the haul-out site out to the wind farm and then moves almost robotically around between the turbines, playing join the dots with the turbine locations. And when we fit statistical models this data to look at how the animals are moving, we can try and estimate what sort of behaviour they were doing. And from this model, it was estimated that when animals were near to the wind turbine foundation, they were much more likely to be exhibiting behaviour that looked like foraging than they were travelling. And vice versa, when they were further away from the wind turbine or when they were sort of on their way out there, they looked like they were much more likely to be travelling than foraging. Now, this may seem a bit odd, but there is a possible explanation here. When we install a wind turbine, we're essentially introducing this new hard substrate under the water into the marine environment. This hard substrate can actually provide a surface on which smaller marine organisms can grow, and over time these habitat forming organisms such as mussels and barnacles and anemones can build up into a small sort of artificial reef. These reefs can then potentially attract fish, as fishing activities are also potentially excluded, mostly excluded from areas of wind farms. And over time, these artificial reefs may even attract larger predators such as marine mammals and seabirds who may come to feed on the fish and invertebrates which are living on it. Now, it's not really clear how in the long term this may affect marine wildlife populations, but it's important to consider this going forward when we think about how wind farms may interact with the marine environment. Hopefully I've given you a bit of a seal's eye view of offshore wind, and I'd just like to finish by saying thanks to the researchers whose work I've shared today, thanks to the funders who funded various bits of this research, and thank you to you for listening.
We don't have the wires to webcam.
Thank you very much, Katherine, for your talk. It was very nice. Sorry, I think we have a little bit of a technical issue, but Cynthia's sorting that. It was a very good presentation, good way to conclude it, I think, a little bit of a positive note. It's nice, I think, that you gave us an overview for another type of devices like the wind turbines, and also another type of disturbance linked to noise. It's true that we mostly hear about porpoises when it comes to wind farm, in fact, so it's really really nice that you looked at seals' behavior. And this is a personal comment, but I think a lot of people might agree with me, but tagging studies are way too cool. Like, I swear, every time I come across one, I'm like, oh, I wish I could do that.
That's true.
No, it's really, really nice.
For
Cynthia so I think we can jump. I don't know how it is going. Do you manage to fix it? No. Well, it's we're here, even if you cannot see us. We can jump into the Q&A. I think we haven't had questions from the audience, which is a first, but it doesn't really matter because I'm sure we have questions.
Animals.
Sorry, I'm a bit trying to like solve the thing. And
how they're going. But I'll start. I have a question actually. I'm always interested, to know how, I suppose just in general to the three of you, how this research meets the industry, like how are the results brought into, I don't know, I suppose the protocols, or when say the wind farms are established, like how does that happen, or where is that interplay? Because I always wonder, you can have your papers published and all, but what's practically in the world, how does that happen?
I'm happy to kick us off if that's all right. Yeah, so you're right. There is occasionally somewhat of a disconnect there, but all potential renewable energy sites in the sea, and indeed I believe on land, are required to undertake environmental impact assessments in order to be able to sort of show demonstrably that the environmental impact is either going to be minimized or mitigated if there are any obvious paths to any negative environmental impacts. And I think the work that we do helps them sort of identify what those might be, because as a developer, they're probably quite in the dark to how the ecology of the region might be affected by their devices. And so having academic research like the ones we present, first of all, give them sort of signposts as to where to look for some potential effects. And then in some cases where significant effects are identified, or potential significant effects are identified, they can then either use that work to guide what the severity might be, or indeed bring researchers on board to conduct site-specific impact assessments to see whether or not any sort of mitigation measures can be drummed up. So the work that we do, kind of by law, to some degree, has to be used so they can actually provide robust and honest environmental impact assessments.
Cool.
Yeah, and then to follow on that, one of my supervisors was a Marine Scotland science, marine mammal expert, and that was directly linked because Marine Scotland are interested in improving, the kind of modelling side of collision risk for tidal, because and that kind of fed off the major development, and that kind of environmental impact assessment really led that stuff forward. They're back.
Yeah, I mean, actually, as far as Nick's work goes as well, it's I'd say probably out of all of the work that we do, Nick's is probably the one that's most directly associated with it as well, because the developers often have to use those collision risk models in order to show what level of impact they might have on local populations. So in sort of very real terms, those tools are actually taken and used. Which is why hopefully they start employing Nick's model a bit more in the future. Now it's out there in the open. Yeah,
excellent. Yeah, it's really important, the interplay between all the different. So we have the science, and then you have law and policy and all of those different things. So it's sometimes definitely a few years ago it's something I wouldn't really have thought about. So I'm learning more and more all the time.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you said there's papers that come out in the sort of legal requirements, but there's also just a lot of informal communication between different groups. There's a lot of good contacts between sort of conservation organisations, developers,
the wider sort of energy companies and the science side as well. And it's a very sort of interactive group of people from all sides. So I think that really helps.
Very cool. Morgan and Cynthia, you are back online.
I could pose a question to you folks over in Galway, because I know there's obviously there's a push globally for renewables. I know there's some projects going on to do with offshore wind, and some projects they're looking at tidal around the west of Ireland. What's the kind of what's the noise coming out of Ireland in terms of like the developments of tidal and wind and marine energy and the potential impacts on marine mammals and etc.
Yeah, the target is 70% from renewable energy by 2030. Probably similar targets in the UK.
I think it's.
No.
I don't know. It's a bit of a tricky issue, because I mean, as first and foremost, I guess as academic researchers, we obviously can't have any idea about which direction we want these to go in the first place. But obviously, as environmental scientists, we want renewables to succeed. But I think as far as the work that we do in forming policy and, you know, possibly even ceasing an installation, I think there's probably too much weight and drive behind renewable proliferation for our work to potentially stop installations. But there definitely is precedent for the sort of work that we do to help inform mitigation measures. So for things like increased noise, which is, as Katie said, a huge issue in the wind farm industry when you're looking at things like pile driving, and then chronic noise of increased vessel traffic and things like this. The information that researchers have gathered on the potential effects on marine mammals has sort of pushed people into thinking about ways that you could deter animals from being in the region in the first place, or have constant monitoring during pile driving, say, that enables you to say, okay, we can continue pile driving now because I haven't seen any porpoises for the last half an hour, or we've seen porpoises in the region, therefore please stop. So I think in terms of how we, I don't want to say mediate because it makes it seem like we have some form of control, but I think in terms of how our work can influence how the industry develops, I think it's more towards that sort of mitigation. And the first step towards mitigation is identifying any potential problems. And I think that's what a lot of the work that we're doing kind of provides.
And do you think that would be more like harder to implement in the case of like the tidal turbines, for example, because they operate underwater? So can you mitigate continuously, or is it?
It's quite a troubling kind of idea. That so at the moment, for example, if you're certain, say the license we have for the marine operations in Strangford Lough, it has a marine mammal observer shutdown protocol in place, and so we are observing during the operations of the tidal turbine. If a marine mammal is detected within the region, within a 50-meter radius, the device, I send a signal to the device and shut that device down.
Okay.
However, the key elements are underwater, and so you don't really actually know whether that animal is going near the device, or it could have already been. Seals can travel quite far underwater, so a 50-meter zone may mean that it could have travelled over that the swept area of the rotors before being spotted at the surface. But then also if you had a 500-meter zone, maybe the turbines would never be in operation. So it's quite a troublesome kind of balancing act. And that only accounts for devices on the surface. So this is a floating tidal turbine. And so then you have, for example, CGen was the first grid-connected tidal turbine. That was in Strangford Lough, and that operated quite far below the surface. And they had active sonar, a live stream of active sonar, and they had a shutdown protocol. If the sonar operator saw a seal, they would shut that down. So that's the mitigation that can be in place, because Strangford Lough's a protected area. It's a SAC for harbour seals, so it has to, under European law, has to be protected. There could be major fines if they're seen to be, if those protections aren't actually seen to be put in place, because it can be major fines that impact on the governmental level. They rack up quickly because I think they're a daily rate fine, which is it racks up very quick. So they are a good reason to protect. They are very strong. It's quite strong protection.
I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that, I guess in terms of the three of us as researchers, our sort of role at the moment is more to try and understand and quantify potential impacts, so that we can predict when they might happen in future developments. So the idea is that the next environmental impact assessment could use this information to try and predict potentially how many seals or how many porpoises may be affected. And I think, as Nick said, like, there's set limits in these environmental impact assessments for a lot of countries of how much disturbance they can cause, or what amount is allowable. And if that was exceeded, then it's possible that they may get sort of consent refused, or they may have to modify or alter their development in such a way that they're not predicted to cause such disturbance. And I guess, but bigger picture, as you said, also mitigation, but also I feel like these results may also inform maybe sort of the engineering side. So they may inform how developers alter or improve their devices over time, sort of in line with things that we might find out from the biology side of how these devices may interact with the environment.
No, it's nice that you have these like tools to kind of estimate these impacts before, because for so many processes we used to like do it and just notice the
Yeah.
impact like 30 years later. So it's quite good to at least have already something in place before we start building large scale arrays of
Yeah.
these things.
Sure.
I think one of the largest issues though that we're facing with regards to all of what's just been said though is the fact that a precautionary approach has to be taken in order to ensure that you know
Definitely.
minimize any potential damage or impact to a local population. But the problem is the degree of uncertainty that we all come up against with the things that we're looking at. And if you've got high degrees of uncertainty and you're adopting a precautionary approach, you end up in a situation where, like Nick was just saying, you can put a tidal turbine in the water, but then any time an animal comes within 50 meters of it, you have to shut it down, which practically speaking might not be feasible for a turbine. You just might not be able to extract enough energy. And you know, there's some evidence for, you know, porpoises, for example, being able to potentially evade these devices at very, very close range. And so we could be, you know, hindering the industry massively by employing these overly conservative mitigation measures, when in actual fact seals are possibly capable of evading these things at very close distances that are quite difficult to monitor. I mean, Nick mentioned about some of the data that's going to be collected to hopefully start informing that. But I think at the moment we're fighting this battle of balances between uncertainty and cautionary approaches.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a slow burn, I think.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's always a trade-off, right? Anyway, like it's complicated, but thank God we have you guys.
It's positive to see that they
yeah.
seem to be able to avoid it anyway.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask actually. I think it was Catherine. You said that the wind farms sometimes they like became like artificial reefs, and so it attracts the seals because they find fish. Do you think there could be a problem if the tidal turbines do the same? Like if it attracts fish, and then the seals they go closer to the blades because there is no food.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, attraction isn't always a good thing. Like you might be bringing animals to areas that are more dangerous, particularly around the tidal turbines, as you said. But also, if you think about the wind turbines as well, if you're bringing seabirds close to an area where there's potentially a group of a habitat that's forming there and potentially good foraging, they might be putting themselves more at risk as well. So it's kind of a whole community approach that we need to sort of think about. And I guess I think they've seen in tidal devices that there is biofouling, it's called, so where things start to grow on the turbine itself. So yeah, it's definitely something we need to think about.
Yeah.
If you want to look at the turbines a bit more as well, Doug Gillespie and Laura Palmer have got a couple of papers out as well that actually do show porpoises, when the turbines aren't rotating, moving through the rotor swept zone, and there is a possibility of increased abundance of prey around there from some other sonar studies. So yeah, totally, like I agree that attraction has to be monitored quite closely. It's not always a benefit.
Yeah, you never know in which way it's gonna go. Like
and it's hard to show how behaviorally how smart these animals are when it comes to, you know, those studies have shown that when the device isn't moving, that they've had individuals moving through the turbine.
So sorry. Like,
mine's fast.
Talking about attracting species, like I was like, oh my god, I saw her coming around. I was like,
wait, what were you saying, Nick?
Sorry.
That's right. Yeah, so you have them going through the device when it's not operating, and then you have what looks like avoidance and potentially even evasion action going on when it is operating. So can these animals actually know what they are? What they're detecting in the water, you know, either through echolocation or the highly sensitive whiskers of seals, etc., and through hearing of seals. Like all those things, all those factors, they're intelligent animals, and but proving that empirically is a very difficult task, and that's where
I can imagine.
I mean, we're just layering on the uncertainty here, but there's also the added issue of demographic and the variation in, you know, potential for attraction or harm with not just different species but different age animals within that. Because I can certainly see a situation where this is pure speculation now, but I can certainly see situations where, you know, if animals are going to come in contact with a tidal turbine in a negative way, I could imagine it would be way more likely to be an infant or a pup or something that was quite naive, that found something novel in the environment, that there was something was a bit, from an adult animal that was a bit more, had seen a few more winters and was a bit more jaded about the way the world works.
There is the fact that it's new devices in the environment, but there might be a learning curve of the species at some point. They will, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess it would be interesting to see how it goes in the future, like with future monitoring and so on, if there's maybe like an improvement just because they are learning from it, like it's true, but that will take a while for sure. But
and young seals are curious, so it's I
Yeah,
remember like monitoring. We had in Goebe, there is a static camera installed at the test site, and I reviewed the footage a bit, and at some point it was just a seal looking at the camera like this, like just what is this? So they're a bit curious.
Yeah, it's a lot of things to, like I guess it's the same with everything. Like once you start like modeling stuff and so on, you just come up with basically unlimited amount of things that you realize, oh god, like this should be taken into account, and like how do I account for this and for that. So yeah, I guess it's always a challenge, of course, like, and with these things it's like it sometimes probably sounds like even more things that you can realize that, oh my god, how am I going to take this into account, like, but
So I think, like, as a cautionary tale from trying to do some of this work, I think one of the biggest keys is start collecting data as early as possible, because from sort of the work on just trying to look at differences in seal distributions, it was quite difficult really to pick out a signal there, because you're so reliant on having a good amount of baseline data, because what you're really trying to determine there is what the difference between whatever normal looks like and what it looks like when you put a new device in the water. And if you don't have good information of what happened before, it's very difficult, not impossible, to detect a change. And I guess Katie probably has insights on that stuff as well. But I guess as this starts expanding more and more into different countries, I think the best advice I would give to trying to do this sort of work would just be collect data as early as possible and hope you can figure out your baselines in order to be able to detect any changes.
Hence the importance of pre-impact assessments, I guess.
Like long-term monitoring, because it's true, if there is already like high variations, I don't know, between years, or it's going to be hard just to see over 1 year if there is a change. Like sometime but it's good that we have the UK leading the way, so that then all the other countries can learn from that.
Yeah, and that comes for the industries as well. We've got the work Katie's going to be doing with all of the 24 gigawatts of Scottish offshore wind and stuff being consented to deal with, and the tidal environmental people can just watch and see what happens. And learn from all that work. So
no pressure, Katie.
Yeah. I need those puffins for my holidays to Scotland, so we've got to look after them.
Yeah. I was going to ask Nick, from your perspective of modelling like collision risk in terms of various factors, like you said, animal factors, environmental factors, device factors. You might not know the answer to this, but do you have any intuition of what aspects of the device might be most important? Is size the thing that, like size of the tidal turbine device, something that might bring the most risk, or is there other things that are more important?
I wouldn't know really. I think, in my opinion, RPM would be one of the biggest factors, but it's all very relative. So you increase the size of the turbine blade, say for wind, for example, you increase the lengths of those rotors. They then offer a larger area for the bird to detect it, and then the tips are going really fast, but then they have to rotate slower because they're larger. So the tips might be going fast, but a large portion of the blade is moving quite slowly. And so that then reduces the risk. And so it really is, there's no one correct answer, because it's like a big web. That graphic I put in my talk where it's all picks off each other, there's another version of that where I tried to link them all, and it covers the whole graphic, because all of the links between all of these different parameters are that it's almost infinite. Like could just go on forever. That, you know, RPMs related to the noise that it produces, the speed that collisions are likely to occur, the ability for an animal to move through the area of the turbine without getting struck, the the detectability of it in terms of visual, all sorts of factors. Like it is all mad. But if I had to pick a device parameter that would be most important, I'd say RPM. Yeah, if I was forced to anyway.
Oh, cool. Yeah, it's really a lot more complicated than it seems like at first glance.
Sounds like, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is when I start to go on about simulations and stuff, but the kind, you can bring it back down to quite somewhat simple ideas of it's how fast, how big of an area that the thing takes up, how fast it moves, how much area an animal takes up, and how fast that moves. That's the simpleness of it, but it's all the data that feeds into those factors that are what complicate it more and more and more.
Very nice, yeah. I'm just to mention, because I didn't want to cut you off, but yeah, basically the issue lasted a bit longer than I thought at the beginning. So thank you for flagging it out in the chat, because otherwise I don't know how long that would have lasted. Really sorry about this again. It never happened before, so I don't really know. It's probably a mistake on my end, well, for sure, on the streaming thing, so I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what was going on at that moment when it didn't work.
No, I think we'll have to.
Yeah, hopefully it was not too long, and we'll just probably we'll have a look like when it stopped. It stopped working, and maybe we'll try to remember what was said at that moment, and we can maybe we'll just summarize it quickly in the chat or something for people to, because I mean, yeah, so that you know what has been going on. I think that, I wanted, before we wrap it up, well, maybe you guys know more about it, but I thought it would be relevant to mention that today, maybe, can you go down? Because I don't remember. Like, I saw yesterday or the day before on Marmam, there was a post about a series of webinars / workshop, I think, that are going to start on discussing practical approaches to reducing human noise impacts for different sound sources, and it's about offshore renewables. So I just thought it would be nice to flag it out. I don't know if you guys know more about it, and if yes, and if you want to comment on it, just go ahead. But yeah, otherwise for the audience, there is this, and we can post the link in the chat. So if some people are interested in it, it came out in Marmam, so I would assume a lot of people got it already, but just in case, it's probably I guess it's a very relevant one. So we'll put it in the chat, and yeah, if someone wants to comment on it, go ahead, of course.
I only saw it yesterday as well. I signed up for it. It does look interesting. But
yeah, it looks really interesting. Yeah. So let's see about that.
This mailing list is so useful. The amount of things we would miss without Marmam is like.
I think, did I write it there? No, I think it starts the 1st of March, if I'm not mistaken. Somewhere in March, so it's very soon actually. But yeah, it sounds very interesting.
It's also US based, I think. So I can't remember exactly when, but it might be an antisocial hour for UK participants.
It's like presentations from 11 to 12 Eastern time.
Oh yeah.
So
whatever that is.
Evening for us.
I think
late afternoon.
I think Eastern time is 4 hours behind, maybe. So
yeah, something
late
like
afternoon
that,
for us. Probably.
Yeah. So yeah, it sounds interesting anyway. Should we wrap it up, I guess?
Maybe, yeah.
Thank you so much, guys, for being here with us. It was really nice and really, really interesting. Like, I talk for myself right now, but I'm not only talking for myself, but it's usually an area that I honestly don't know much about, because it's quite away from what I do species-wise and topic-wise, yeah. So I was really looking forward to know a bit more about it, and definitely now I feel smarter with this.
And
Thanks to
the
you guys.
discussion was so interesting as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
And it's really helps that you know what each other is working on, because then the
Yeah.
questions and comments were very, very like on point. So
Yeah,
very good.
yeah.
Thank you so much for this.
Yeah, and I want to mention as well that you've been an amazing team as well, because like the way you just collaborated with each other, like to make it on the point and so on, it's
To
really
prepare
nice.
the
So
webinar,
thank you so
yeah.
much for that.
Mm.
And yeah, I'm sure the audience will value that as well, because it was very fluid in the way it was articulated. So thank you for that so much. And yeah. On this, maybe what else about the webinar? What do we have to say?
We have to say that we got a bit like thrown off by all the issues. So we
Yeah,
forgot
a bit like
the next episode. I'm very happy about this. Not everyone is as excited as me, but it's going to be on porpoises. Yeah. Because people don't know enough about porpoises. So that's what we can say for now, but we will come up with more details very soon.
Very soon. And yeah, same as always, the last Friday of every month. So we'll be back basically next month. So Friday the 25th of March. So don't miss out. On that, again, if you enjoyed this, just subscribe and share to whoever you think might be interested. For the webinars, you can rewatch anytime you want all the episodes on the website. And if you would like to share your work with us for a future episode, like please reach out. We don't have a tight, we are not super far ahead with our episodes, so we have some ideas and so on, but we're open for suggestions. So please feel free to reach out to us if you would like to participate. And on that, I think we can close it off. Thank you so much again to our speakers, and hopefully see you soon. I don't know, at a conference or something, now that freedom is a bit more of a thing. Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.